Well, I'm certainly humbled. Many terrific talks so far. I recognize many faces. Hopefully, I'll get to meet some more people and meet new friends. I'm going to switch gears a little bit with these next two talks. We've been focusing mostly aqueous phase, PFAS, and either soils, mostly water, because we're this is focusing on the Great Lakes. In this case, we're going to start looking at surface water foams, which is a different media type. I would say my background, I have a degree in evolutionary biology, also master's degree in geology with graduate work in botany. So I'm a multidisciplinarian, not a chemist. I'm certainly not a PFAS expert, but as I've evolved in my career in the last 5 years, I'm certainly focusing on emerging contaminants. So I'm going to preface a little bit about how this work came about, et cetera. So here we go. So framing just some context, the folks that are working on surface water foams are few and far between. I know most of the people that are really studying this effect of these foams. Certainly, the funding was done by Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, Eagle, through the MPART group. And it's great to have a client that is interested in why. What had happened was Eagle became interested in the surface water foams that were coming upon beaches and different areas where people congregate. So we wanted to understand not so much the genesis, but how are these foams transported? In terms of precedents, there had been some work done by folks at Battelle. This is through an EPA initiative. I've got a few references here if folks want to look at it. Our study was from 2019 through early 2021, where we collected samples statewide in Michigan from 4 rivers and 3 inland lakes. Ultimately, this work was presented in a study that's available. It's now public domain. Note, I'm showing this picture of the foam here in this high energy environment below a dam. As these foams are in the environment, and this is not AFFF, this is foam that's originating from the open water. These foams tend to change, and as they reach a terrestrial environment, they become an aggregate, a mixture of not only terrestrial components, but also the water itself. So let me move on here. So some claims here. This is not about fractionation and enrichment. There are other folks that are studying this that are doing a great job. One of my colleagues, Doran Bogdan, is certainly a person that's worked on this with Jennifer Field and other folks. But this is a reasonable explanation of how these surface water foams get from point A to point B. Now, there are some uncertainties here that I need to point out. These models that I'm going to show do not assume venting plumes. So if you have a groundwater plume that's laced with PFAS and it's entering a surface water body, these models assume that the PFAS is in the surface water. And we have empirical evidence to back that up. And then also when you're getting in on the Great Lakes, you have some effects due to SAISH, right? Unusual weather occurrences. Then also you have climatic conditions due to storm events, et cetera. So those are anomalous conditions not assumed in the models. So what are surface water foams? There's a lot written. Folks that study foams really are mostly oceanographers, atmospheric scientists, and you'll see this on a global scale. And the foams are both natural, right? And they're also of anthropogenic origin. And there's a whole range of surfactants that are in the environment. It isn't just the PFAS. But we know these foams form in both marine, freshwater, and also brackish habitats. Now, compositionally, these foams are really an aggregate of water, different gases, right? Biogenic gases, air, but also there's both natural and synthetic compounds. I'll talk a little bit about that. And then there's also naturally occurring material, things like minerals, sediments, plant material, organic carbon, et cetera. So if you notice in this, this is a stable foam collected in a fluvial environment. And if you note this foam, it is an aggregate where it's mixed up. There's little particulates, there's mineral phases within that foam. So this is not a pure so-called PFAS foam. Now, I struggled with this slide. I do all this stuff in Adobe Illustrator where I layer the information. And I wanted to call this diagenesis of surface water foams. However, our research is early, and I want to collect more chemical data to see if there actually is a change in the chemical makeup of these foams from open water to the terrestrial environment. Now, when you look at this, this is not about how the foams develop. What is the genesis? It's probably related to micelle formation within the surface microlayer. And that trigger point is usually in the low parts per million range, right? And as part of this study, we did not study the surface microlayer. There's other folks that have looked at that. But certainly what we see are development of, this is our terminology here that we've created. There are surface water foam nuclei. And we see this out in the open, out in the lake in this particular case. And these nuclei tend to aggregate as they move around, slosh around in the water. Now, this isn't only PFAS within the water. There are natural surfactants such as saponins, soap-like compounds. There's also a broad group, a broad umbrella term of compounds that are root exudates. So these are naturally occurring detergents, surfactants within the water. But as this foam moves along on the surface water, it tends to aggregate. And then what we've noticed is they develop a sail. And this is analogous to, this is my biology background, it's analogous to a Portuguese man of war has that bit of a peak. And we see that, and what happens is that peak catches the air, right, the wind, and then it will migrate closer to the littoral zone, or that zone of wave energy. And what happens is that foam gets beat up. And then eventually when it reaches the terrestrial side, it becomes an aggregate where it's mixed up due to the wave action. Now, people that study foams, invariably one class of people are people that make beer, right? They're studying, they're interested. If you drink a Belgian ale, that foam will break, and it goes from what's called a wet phase to a dry phase. We know that happens. And when it breaks at that dry phase, is really interesting because we believe that it's liberating the PFAS as it breaks. So I'll go through this model here. There are some components that are very important. The surface microlayer is this hair thin layer. And the way you sample that is with dip plates, usually glass adhesion samplers. And it's about 100 microns roughly in thickness, right? And then the Newston layer is a zone of planktonic activity. So this is the photic zone, and it's a lipid-rich layer, right? And as environmental scientists and PFAS practitioners, we're very interested in that enrichment zone. But you also have a sediment water interface. You have the littoral zone, you have a shoreline, and then you have, in this case, a beach with a groundwater table. Now, as the wind starts moving in, a few things change. The other aspect that you have here is the groundwater to surface water interface. So that is a zone of flux, right? In this case, the water can be a losing or gaining condition. Now, the model assumes that there's PFAS, PFOA, other PFAS, plus other synthetic surfactants are probably in the water, along with synthetic surfactants. Now, what happens, and this can be really challenging to try and sample these foams, the wind will kick up and we'll have foam develop within hours. And then in many instances, it ends up on the shoreline. So we're out trying to sample, we mobilize crews to go out there and collect samples. And by the time we get out there, a lot of times that foam breaks and it's gone. So the idea of putting up remote telemetry units, cameras, that kind of thing has occurred to us. But again, you get this as the wind develops, you get this wave break here along the shoreline in the littoral zone. Now, here I'm showing how these foams develop, right? And it is an evolution of the foams, and we see that. And at some point, this foam can be mistaken for an emulsion, right? Because it's really changed and it's altered and it's beat up. But as it reaches that terrestrial side, again, it's picking up particulates. It becomes an aggregate, right? Now, the fascinating aspect of all this moving through is what's going on at the GSI and within the so-called hypereic zone. And aquatic toxicologists are probably interested in this. But as that foam goes from a wet to a dry phase, it collapses. And those PFAS that are enriched within that foam, and the enrichment can be a couple orders of magnitude higher. So as that foam collapses, that PFAS is potentially released back into the groundwater. So you've got this zone of enrichment. Now, what we'd like to do, the ideal way to test that hypothesis is you go in and you install some carbon flux units and you look at mass flux within that zone, right? So that's a whole nother part of a study that we're going to be engaged with. And I'm pretty certain some other folks have looked at that. Now, that was the lacustrine model, or one lacustrine model. It gets a little bit more challenging when you get into the dynamics of fluvial systems. Now, here's a well-known site in Rockford, Michigan. This is obviously a spillway. And I've drawn some, thank you, Liz. I've drawn some turbulent currents here. And what you do get is an eddy pool conversion of these different flows. And so you'll see this foam congregate here in this eddy pool. And then you also have this along shore, this wall here, you tend to get this, the PFAS will accumulate in these eddy pools. And this is an area, of course, where known for fishing. You get fishermen wading throughout this. So the state of Michigan is very much concerned, and they've posted placards about avoid contact with these enriched foams. This is a simplified model that we've developed here for fluvial transport below a spillway or a dam. Now, there's some similarity to grandma whipping up a lemon meringue pie. So the albumin, she's whipping up the albumin, or maybe I'm doing that. And so those proteinaceous substances develop a meringue. Well, the same effect is occurring here with surfactants that are coming out of this impoundment, going down the spillway. You've got this zone of aeration, of turbulence. So that's why you see these foams quite often. We see natural foams at places like Tequamanon Falls in Michigan's UP, zones of high energy, and that foam whips up largely due to humic substances, right? But you get this eddy pool develop, and these foams tend to congregate. They're always there in these pools. Well, what happens is, depending on how the sluices are arranged, et cetera, these foams can start migrating downriver. And then what we find is they get hung up on snags. In this case, I'm showing this brush at number 8. But as they go farther downstream, right, they get hung up in bayous, they get hung up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is, I think, really fascinating to study this. We're learning more and more. We want to understand more about the dynamics of the foam as they attenuate and change as they move downstream. That wraps these two models. My next talk gets into microbiology. I'm sure a lot of folks would be really fascinated about that.